Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Linnean Society. Welcome to our Society's Founders' Day lecture, which is one of the three significant events we have through the year. And this one celebrates the founding of our society in 1788 by celebrating the birthday on the 2nd of December in 1759 of James Edward Smith, who was the founder of our society, who bought the Linnean collections of Linnaeus's descendants and brought them to the UK and founded the society around them. So James Edward Smith is there in the corner of the bust, and he's got a nice little floral decoration. To those who are not members of the society, and to those who maybe even are not attending for the very first time, very, very warm welcome to you. It's great to see you here at the Society for this meeting. Our membership is a very broad church. It's not just scientists, as some outsiders may think. We cover many disciplines associated with the study of natural history, so history of science, arts and culture, conservation, ecology, all sorts of subjects, all people brought together into a community which is passionate about protecting nature, making sure it's understood and appreciated and there for the future. For those who are actively working on promoting nature, then we open the fellowship to those people. But some people feel they just want to support, they don't want to get involved in active engagement. So we have another membership category of associates, and we have student associates who have a discounted membership. And there was a QR code on the slides which you can get information about becoming a member. I very much encourage you to do that. I hope that you'll be inspired after listening to this lecture to get involved in the society. I'd like to give a special welcome to our fellows. I know we have quite a number of our fellows here in the room today. Can I ask you to raise your hands if you're a fellow, please? Well, look at that. That's fantastic seeing you around. For those who are not fellows, look around, and whoever's put their hand up, talk to them in the reception afterwards, and they'll enthuse you about the society, how enjoyable it is, and what they get out of being a fellow. So fantastic. Welcome to our fellows. Lastly, on the introductions, I just like to say that our shop, which you may have noticed as you came in, has got a 15% discount this evening. So on all goods apart from things which are already discounted or in bundles. So if you want to avail yourself of that 15% discount for Christmas, then see people as you leave the lecture theatre this evening. As I said, the speaker tonight really embodies this broad church that we have in the society. Jenny Uglow is a historian of the history of natural history. She's particularly interested in the links between science, art, and literature. She said not to take too much time in talking about her, but I'd like to point out that she's worked on various projects such as the Edward Lear project, on a biography of Edward Lear, worked on the Lunar Society of Birmingham, which included such luminaries as Erasmus Darwin, Josiah Wedgwood, and Joseph Priestley. And she's written a book called In Their Times, which talked about the Britain throughout the Napoleonic Wars. But this evening, she's going to be talking to us about Gilbert White. Gilbert White published his Natural History of Selborne in 1789. It's been a figure of actually quite recent attention by several people. His book was groundbreaking with the intimacy of his records of the natural history in his local patch. He was born and lived most of his life in Selborne. And by his, what he said, watching narrowly, he made some astute and very valuable records of the natural history in his area. His empathy with the creatures he found there, from hedgehogs and bats to harvest mice and frogs, and his beloved swifts and swallows, was quite groundbreaking. He brought these together in his book and teaching us to see the riches of our own local patch by observing carefully. So I'm enthralled what you're going to be talking about, Jenny, this evening. And please, would you come and give your lecture entitled A Year with Gilbert White, the First Great Nature Writer.
Thank you. Well, it is lovely to be here, and particularly, to give the founders lecture because I worked here quite a lot, and I can't think of a more beautiful place to work. And also the Selborne Society's collection of Gilbert White's papers are here in the library. And some of them wonderfully are laid out for you to see, and other extraordinary books too. I do hope that you've come up and had a look, because it makes me feel very surrounded by Gilbert White and his brother John, but also astonishing to have the 10th edition of the Systema Naturae annotated by Linnaeus himself. It's a treat and a thrill. And the Selborne Society material too has recently been recatalogued by Liz McGow with the help of Steph Holt from the Natural History Museum. So it's also a celebration of that work too, I think. Anyway, so I'm starting. I've got a rather funny title, which is a revolutionary outdoor naturalist, because Gilbert White was rather a kind of quiet, conservative person. And I think that one word he would not like to be applied to himself was revolutionary. He said he was a gentleman to the end. But he is in an odd way. And this is Selborne in May, which doesn't look like a very revolutionary spot. I mean, no blood on the cow parsley there. And people who've been there, and I'm sure an awful lot of people here have been to Selborne. Yeah. Well, you may recognize it. This is the little path from behind the pub, which goes alongside the edge of Gilbert White's land, leading to the hanger, the wood behind the meadow, and to the famous zigzag path, which goes up to the top of that. And I thought, well, who would call this sort of chatty, modest, conservative curate from small Hampshire village, and one of many parson naturalists, revolutionary? Yet I think he was, as Mark said, he was groundbreaking in the way that he worked and the way that he thought and the way that he wrote. So for a start, he's our first published field naturalist. People say the first field naturalist, but I'm absolutely sure people went out and looked and worked the same way. But he happened to write in the spirit of the outdoor naturalist way of thinking. And he only wrote one book, as we know, The Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne, and it took him 20 years to write. And I think that was his problem, because if you are writing about natural history and everything you see, there is always something more to discover. And he said he was a terrible procrastinator, but really he just kept adding and adding and moving and finding and slightly changing his mind. And his text was virtually wrenched out of his hands by his family in the end. So we're very lucky to have it. And it was published in 1789 and has allegedly never been out of print since. But it was startlingly original. And I think instead of theoretical speculation and taxonomy, which were the great sort of genre of the day, really, he wrote about what he called the lives and conversation of animals. In other words, their behavior and their interaction. And he wrote in a very intimate, as he said, and lively way. So he was not doing anything fashionable. He was doing something that he knew was new. And it's tenderness too, amused, tender, awestruck, questioning. And the books appealed across generations. And the slides I show reflect that, I hope, because of the different ways people have looked at his work and at natural history itself from his time to today. It had a sort of slow building impact, but quite quickly, Thomas Bewick, engraver, is quoted often. His Land Birds came out 1797, not quite a decade later, and he called him the excellent Mr. White. If you really want to know something, the excellent Mr. White is the place to look. And then you've got Wordsworth and Coleridge admired it. John Clare very touchingly saved up his pocket money to buy a copy. And later it became a sort of vision, not just of natural history, but of the village of Selborne itself. So emigres apparently took it with them to the colonies. Soldiers read it in the trenches in the First World War as a sort of reminder of home. And it became oddly romanticized. I mean, Thoreau called it a kind of Eden, which it very definitely is not. I mean, Gilbert White's view is not Edenic, it's not idyllic. And today, I think we look at him very differently, not as a nostalgic picture of pre-industrial England, but as a pioneer of ecology, alert to the way that plants and creatures are dependent on particular habitats, land use and climate, and above all, acutely aware of the interlinked nature of everything on Earth. And so this study of the conversation of animals is also a key step towards ethology in examining behavior that combines field studies with laboratory work. He was keen, he liked to, dissect. He was very, very analytical of the material in front of him. And with work on anatomy and instinct and learning. And his book is made up, as you know, the core of the book is his correspondence with two fellow naturalists, Thomas Pennant and Daines Barrington. And the idea of correspondence is the form of communication, scientific communication at the time. That doesn't seem new. But the idea of using it in this kind of book was absolutely brilliant, because letters are open and direct, so that you still feel, if you read it, that he's speaking directly to you. You engage in the conversation. It allows you to pick up topics and drop them and return to them. It allows you to say, I'm not very sure about this, but I will find out. It allows you to stop and say, I don't know any more about this. And then somebody will interject and you can carry it on. It follows time. It's written in a day. It will tell you what the weather is, so that you feel in the company of the person that is writing. It looks tremendously spontaneous, but of course it was very much edited, cut, added to, and he kept adding anecdotes, particularly from his journals. And in my book that Mark referred to, I follow one of those for 1781, just going through the year and going backwards and forwards to his life. But as well as being an outdoor naturalist, I think it is also his focus, as was said, on one particular area. His home parish of Selborne is quite new, and it's a study of what we do call today, our local patch. But his interest is not only local, it ripples out. So it's family, village, university, naturalists in Britain and abroad, and into sort of wide European scholarship. It is definitely not just simply rooted in Selborne. And the thing is that his informal style in these letters also has the effect of making you think that anybody can contribute. We can all contribute to this kind of understanding or collecting of knowledge. He talks to everybody. He talks to farm boys and farmers and vicars and local gentry, and the woman that, women in the village will bring him a bird's nest. The boys go out and find him eggs, but also get rid of wasp nests for him. That whole sense of a whole lot of people who would not call themselves experts or even scholars or anything, all bringing their knowledge to contribute to what he puts together. And I think that is a forerunner of what we might call today's citizen science, the thought that if you all work together, you can actually build a body of knowledge. And Charles Darwin, venerably here on the wall, as a schoolboy, wrote, from reading White's Selborne, I took much pleasure in watching the habits of birds, and even made notes. In my simplicity, I remember wondering why every gentleman did not become an ornithologist. And one of Gilbert White's 20th century editors, James Fisher, described him as the man who started us all bird watching. So there's that. There's the new way of looking, deciding to write, the form of the book, the local patch, the involvement of the community, encouragement to others. But there's a third way too, which I think he was revolutionary, and that's not often considered. I think that because the mid to late 18th century is often called, and indeed prided itself on being, the age of sensibility. And that's measured by the intensity of your emotional response, whether it's to art or to music or to nature. Sort of tears at the plight of a caged bird, or delight at a dog's devotion, or ecstasy at a sunset, and so on. And one of Gilbert White's great achievements was to bridge that world, the worlds of sensibility and natural history, with not only allowing feeling to enter descriptions of nature, very unscientific, but pondering on how feeling is demonstrated by creatures themselves. And that connects to his further interest, which is on the relationship between reason and instinct. So, but first, I think, what kind of outdoor naturalist was he? As we've heard, one of his favorite phrases is watching narrowly. I watched it narrowly, and here he is doing just that. Right? We can't watch narrowly. And this is him. There was a pair of white owls that nested under the eaves of the church, as he writes about. It's just sort of, there we are with him, as it were, or he's telling us what he does. We have had, ever since I remember, a pair of white owls that constantly breed under the eaves of the church about an hour before sunset, for then the mice begin to run. They sally forth in quest of prey. In this irregular country, we can stand on an eminence and see them beat the fields over like a setting dog, and often drop down in the grass or corn. I have minuted these birds with my watch for an hour together, and have found that they return to their nest, the one or the other of them, about once in 5 minutes. So that's that particular cast of mind that many of you probably share, which is keen observation, huge patience, meticulous record keeping. And he takes it further. He walks up to the church to actually see what they're doing, and notices how the owl has to move the mouse from its beak, from its claws to its beak, in order to crawl up under the eaves. And it's that kind of detail, not that people hadn't noticed before, but they certainly had not written about in a book, to actually follow that detail of activity. And there's sort of gripped absorption in what he's seeing. And he's not alone. I said John Clare was an admirer, and here's Clare 25 years later, or April 30 years later, April 1825. And Clare writes, I observed a snail on his journey at full speed, and I marked by my watch, just like Gilbert, that he went 13 inches in 3 minutes, which was the utmost he could do without stopping to wind or rest. So by that time, we're allowed to identify this poor little old snail. Anyway, Gilbert is watching from his irregular eminence, and we can see that here. This is Selborne seen from the Short Lythe, which is one of the hills that goes out each side. They're having a picnic in a Turkish tent, looking towards the village, which is kind of on a shelf underneath the hill in the background to the west, with the which is covered with the beechwood, and as the hanger. This is one of 12 scenes that he commissioned in 1776, when he began to feel his book needed illustrations, which his friend said, another form of procrastination. Get on with it. You don't really need illustrations. But he did. And this particular one was used as a beautiful fold-out frontispiece when the book was engraved, when the book was finally published. And this is very much his village. You could see that the church is slightly out of scale, I think, in order to suggest its importance. His grandfather was the vicar there for many years, And Gilbert White was born in the vicarage next door in 1720. His grandfather bought a house just across the road, which Hieronymus Grimm has shown, as it were, tucked into the middle of the picture below the hanger. And this was called The Wakes. And when his grandfather died, his widow Rebecca moved across the road, and Gilbert White's parents eventually moved back there when he was 10. And Gilbert was the eldest of 8 surviving children. So if you imagine them all crammed into a quite kind of small house, small children, toddlers, who would, I think, be outdoors all the time. And from childhood on, he knew every inch of the village and the lands beyond, every copse, every ditch, every brook. And he's particularly aware, too, of the way that the different soils in this landscape create a remarkable variety of habitats. And the top of the hanger is grey clay and flint. And then there are different kinds of chalk, as it were, as you move down the hanger. And that gives way in the valley that they're looking down on, which is very fertile, called Dorton, to what he calls a warm forward crumbling mould, very called black marm. And this valley itself runs eastwards to a quite different area, which is the sandy soil of warmer forests. So there's an enormous variety of habitats, an enormous variety of birds and creatures there. And Gilbert was a bit worried about asking Grimm to begin with, because he thought Grimm had rather a keen sense of humour, and he wanted his pictures to be serious. But I think there's no, they are serious, but there is a slight humour or edge here, simply in terms of class. You have the night leisured people having their picnic on the hill while the villagers are toiling in the lands below. But as I've said, Gilbert White was very much involved in the lives of everybody in the village, and also convinced that humans, as we know to our cost now, land management is a vital part of creating these habitats, sort of coppicing, building barns, ditching. So that the people there are part of the landscape, part of the environment, both as living in it and attending it, but also as we're creators of the environment. And that responsibility is felt, I think, in his book. But the family did have wider horizons, and Gilbert went to Oxford, he went to Oriel. And you can see his record keeping was there from the start. This is the only portrait that we have of him, which was on the flyleaf of a book drawn by a fellow student. And he kept his records, he kept his accounts very carefully, and he does seem to be having rather a good time. It's plenty of, if you can read it from down there, he's got lemons and rum and sugar, and he's having new suits and things like that. He enjoyed the whole Oxford life of being a sort of man of the world. But I think that at Oxford too, we see him slightly differently. Among his closest friends were literary. There are 3 poets, Tom and Joseph Warton and William Collins. And it's important to remember that he too wrote poetry all his life. And in the little notes, even in his journals, you feel that sort of poetic, lyrical view of nature. Very, very short, very rhythmic, very musical, tiny, just quick notes like ice bears, boys slide. Woodlarks hang suspended in the air and sing all night. Swifts copulate in the air as they fly. The water shines in the fallows. As autumn, larches turn yellow, ash leaves fall, the hanger gets thin. So he thinks like that. He has that lyrical note in his writing as well. And he would have quite liked an academic career. In 1752, he returns to Oxford as junior proctor in the college. And 1757, he tries, but failed to become elected as provost. And if he had, maybe we would never have had the natural history of Selborne. So I think we're quite glad that he didn't get that job. And from now on, he did concentrate on Selborne. He was offered various livings by Oriel, but he really didn't want to move. And he spent his life as curate of the nearby village of Farringdon, and at the end of his life, different points in Selborne itself. So from 1751, really, when he is back in Selborne, he's already keeping his first diary, which is the garden calendar. This is his garden calendar, which he began, and it's everything about fruit, flowers, vegetables. He starts, I think, the first week planting 250 cabbages, but his particular concentration on the fashionable art of forcing cucumbers and growing melons. He wanted to be a forward-looking scientific gardener. And so we have many experiments with hotbeds and so forth. But at the same time, he and his brothers are also creating a witty variation of a garden on Gothic and neoclassical lines with walks and urns and a statue of Hercules cut out of wood and a vista through 5-barred gates and terrace and a ha-ha. I think they had great fun making this. And one key feature was the zigzag path up the hanger, which was built by his brother John in 1752. And it had a little hermitage on the top. And his Gilbert White was not at all concerned that he actually didn't own this wood. It belonged to Magdalen, who owned the parish, but they didn't seem to mind. But so he's got his zigzag path, he's got his hermitage, and for that you need a hermit. So here is his brother Henry, fully togged up as a hermit. And this too, rather charmingly, a vignette of Harry with his straw-clad dell is on the title page of the Natural History of Selborne. And this is unbelievably full and very detailed, very lively, but slowly the mood changes. And first of all, with regard to botany, because there's huge public interest in the 1750s and earlier in botany, partly because of the number of new species, but also because of the Linnean hierarchy of natural life and the new terms he introduced. So his botanical classification starts in the mid-1730s and is introduced really in the species Plantara of 1753. And then the nomenclature, I think most of all important, is in the 10th edition here of the Systema Naturae, which we have here, which uses the nomenclature to apply to animals as well. But sort of inspired by this, in the late 1750s, Gilbert White begins bringing wildflowers into his garden. He brings hellebore, he brings Daphne from the hanger. And in the following decade, his interest in botany grows. He reads, it's 2 books really that he reads almost simultaneously. 1765, he was the 2nd edition of Benjamin Stillingfleet's tract relating to natural history, husbandry, and physic. And Stillingfleet includes a calendar of flora of Uppsala made in 1755 by Alexander Berger, plus his own calendar of flora from Norfolk. So it's a comparative book. And his suggestion is that noting the growth of wildflowers and the coincidences of birds arriving, singing, and nesting would help to create a natural calendar that would be useful for planting and harvest. And Gilbert White's very drawn, I think, to the idea of improvement in relation to this. But in the same year, 1765, he reads William Hudson's Latin Flora Anglica, which is also on display here, and which uses the new Linnean terms. And he annotates this with plants found in Selborne. He finds 439 species. This inspires him to make his own flora of Selborne. And again, we've got it here. It's absolutely beautiful. It's just sort of rag paper, separate sheets, and then eventually stitched into a book. And he sort of starts, he starts slowly, he now goes through the year, and he just noting everything, but he is bringing in these coincidences of birds singing and nesting and so on, so that the two will come together. And he's got garden flowers and the wildflowers. But while he's doing this, does it for the whole of 76, other things are happening too. I mean, his brother Ben, who's a London bookseller and publisher specializing in natural philosophy, so that the bookshop becomes a kind of salon. And through Ben, Gilbert White meets Banks and Solander, Thomas Pennant, and many other naturalists. And 1767, he begins writing to Thomas Pennant, who is then revising his British zoology and terribly glad of more information, had sent out questionnaires and so forth. And when Gilbert White returns to his garden calendar, to his old diary, the tone is slightly different, and you suddenly see animals and birds appearing in far more detail. And this is the harvest mouse, and which he described this little mouse to Pennant when they met in town, and he promised to send some if he found any. And he found this one nest in a wheat field, and he said, and he described how the strips are woven into a tight ball, perfectly round and the size of a cricket ball. And it's so ingeniously made that you couldn't see where the entrance was. Well, I think if you can see where the entrance is, it's empty, so it's perpetually closed. And it could roll it across the table. But he was then sort of astonished. It's that thing of thinking, how can this be? This little nest contained 8 tiny baby mice. So how could the dam manage to give a teat to each mouse? How did it work inside that ball? How did she squeeze in when the nest is stuffed to the brim with these babies getting bigger every day? It's a wonder of nature and an astonishment to him. But he's still a scientist. He's still quite ruthless. He gets hold of a young mouse and a female with young, both of which, he says proudly, I have preserved in brandy. The sentiment is not come into that. He is the first person to describe the harvest mouse, but because he took so long to write his book, a German naturalist also discovered one of the Volga Delta, I think, and described it in published form, so not named after the Gilbert White mouse. So at this point too, this whole business of looking in a wheat field, his belief in local observation intensifies. So in October 1768, he's writing, all nature is so full that the district produces the greatest variety, which is the most examined. In terms of districts, the same year, 1768, he begins an intense correspondence with his brother John, who's a chaplain in Gibraltar. They'd been rather estranged, but this begins again with Gilbert suggesting that John should write a natural history of Gibraltar, which indeed he did over many, many years, but it never was published, and all that we have left is a sort of small introduction. But you get a very, very definite feeling of a fantastically detailed circle of exchange. Gilbert White sends him books from his brother Ben. John sends specimens back. Gilbert disperses them to an entomologist or to Pennant and so on, and they will confer. It goes back again. Gilbert says, you must write to Linnaeus, you must write to Scopoli. And you see just how amazingly full these letters are. These are letters here. These are in the Linnean. And we have examples of John's letter from Gilbert to John, and indeed John White's letter to Linnaeus, very charming, in front of us here. So these are the kind of things, write to Scopoli. He's very clever. Now, this was actually another little spur to show that Gilbert White is not solely local, was his reading of Giovanni Scopoli's pioneering studies of the flora and insects and birds in Carniola, which is now in Slovenia. And he is insistent that these are the vital kinds of studies. He writes to Pennant, for as no man alone can investigate all the works of nature, these partial writers may, each in their department, be more accurate in their discoveries and freer from errors than more general writers, and so by degrees may pave the way to an universal correct natural history. But vital as Gilbert White thought the work that Linnaeus was doing, though he's very rude here, isn't he, about his engravings of insects. He thought that taxonomy was not all. This is he insists from now and onwards on field work. He says taxonomy is invaluable because we could not understand anything without a system. But it's more important, in his view, to study the behavior of animals and birds and insects in their habitat than just to label them. Writers stuck in their studies, he said, could only offer, this is quoting him, bare descriptions and a few synonyms. The true naturalist must get outside. Investigation of the life and conversation of animals is a concern of much trouble and difficulty, not to be obtained but by the active and inquisitive, and by those that reside much in the country. He's still interested in the idea of establishing a natural calendar, but he knew you'd have to collect information over a very long time, involving a great pile of separate records. And he needs a way to order this, and finds this with, in 1768, with the Naturalist's Journal, designed by Daines Barrington. And here it is. This is his first year, 1768. It's wonderful. It's terribly cleverly designed, using his grid format, with each sheet covering a week. So the days run down the left side, the page is ruled into 10 columns. It's like a sort of 18th century Excel spreadsheet. The first columns are for such things as pressure, temperature, wind direction, rainfall. Then come specific notes. Trees first in leaf, fungi first appeared, etc. And then the column on the right for miscellaneous observations. And even in the first year that he's using it here, it's already overflowing. And it covers everything. Garden is still there, but here we've got the female viper with a string of eggs within her as large as those of a blackbird. The snipes playing over the moors, asking questions again, piping and humming. They always hum, it says here, as they are descending. Is not their hum ventriloquist like that of the turkey? Some suspect it is made by the wings. I think it's now known to be the drumming of the tail feathers. But it's already overflowing at mad, and as he goes on, this becomes more and more extreme, so that he can actually use the opposite page to make detailed notes. This one is a particular one of the notes in his miscellaneous observations. Simply says the buzzard sits hard, and that prompts him to write this story, very typical movement about a pair of buzzards in the hangar, beginning, as it were, like a story, like a sort of storytelling mode, upon a tall, slender beach in the middle of the bostel. A pair of honey buzzards, built their nest, etc. But then, when the boy brings the egg, it becomes very scientific, and comparing the honey buzzard to the common buzzard, describing it, describing the foliage, describing what's in its core, etc., and so forth, so that you have a technical description in the middle, and then returns to the bird, a quite different kind of tone, which actually moves, as it were, into the bird's being. The male honey buzzard still haunts about the hangar, and on sunny mornings soars above the hill to inhale the coolness of the upper air. It's very evocative and sort of emotional, but calm at the same time. So he tries to use his journal as a calendar of markers in the way that he should. And one of the things that he likes to notice is the arrival of the different insects. He writes about everything. he writes about ants, wasps, spiders, turnips, sawfly, and then he sees the brimstone butterfly in March, the great dragonfly, as he talks about in June, the field cricket, which he investigated with his brother Tom in May, the swallowtail, which is here in July. And these wonderful illustrations are from Edward Donovan's Natural History of British Insects, which is also in the Linnean. Well, I don't know if it's there at the moment, because when I was using it to take these pictures, it was discovered it had red rust or something. I think it's now been carefully conserved. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. So he does mark a slight shifts with the changing of the season. I don't think about the insects and the crickets is the value of looking at the very small, the what I regarded as sort of insignificance, and often even creatures that are ignored. For example, contrary to contemporary belief, he insists worms are very far from torpid in winter, that come out every night in mild weather. And he says, as anyone could see who would take the pains to examine his grass plots with a candle. So to actually get out. The most insignificant insects and reptiles, he said, are of much more consequence and have much more influence in the economy of nature than the incurious are aware of, and are mighty in their effect. That's something that we're truly recognizing now. Worms might appear a small and despicable link in the chain of nature, yet if lost would make a lamentable chasm, vital for birds and animals, but also great promoters of vegetation by boring, perforating, loosening the soil, and rendering it pervious to rain and the fibers of plants. So a good monograph on worms, he felt, would open a new field in natural history. And that, of course, did appear 100 years later, or more, in 1881, as the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms by Charles Darwin, a keen admirer of it. And I put this small slide next to it simply because I think that we do now. Now, if you are out of a walk and look at your feet, the things that you will find, and this extraordinarily beautiful thing of a swallowtail moth with raindrops actually on its back. And I said, is it dead? Is it dead? No, it's just that the water would go off. So just for us all to keep looking at the small and insignificant. And also he says, are despised reptiles, which they were at the time. And here is the adder. There's a lovely late journal entry. He looks at adder vipers quite often. 1790, he gives a startling description of finding a newly cast, I don't know how to say it, slough or slough, when they cast their skin, slough. And he imagines the snake entangled in the grass, changing his coat. It looked, he said, as if it had been turned inside out and as drawn off backward like a stocking or a woman's glove. That's very vivid. Not only the skin, but the scales from the very eyes are peeled off and appear on the head of the slough like a pair of spectacles. So he picks it up and he actually peers through these spectacles. And he imagines himself sort of into the snake, a bit like with the honey buzzard. And he notes that the eye scales loosen as the new skin is forming. And while this is happening, the creature in appearance must be blind and feel himself in an awkward, uneasy situation. So to empathize with an adder is uncommon at the time. And his real love was for the birds, and the great debate at the time about the birds was that of migration. He watches, as we do, for the chiffchaff to arrive in the spring. And even on migration, Gilbert White wobbles. He really goes back and forth. I can't quite tell. He sort of, it troubles him. And when he thinks of these little warblers, the willow wren, when the chiffchaff coming first, and then the flycatcher, which nests above his parlour window, being the last of the summer arrivals, he says it's upsetting, really, to imagine them flying so far across the ocean. I am at a loss even what to suspect about them, he says, with regard to their migration. What difficulties attend that supposition, that such feeble bad flyers who the summer long never flit, but from hedge to hedge, should be able to traverse vast seas and continents in order to enjoy milder seasons amidst the regions of Africa. And this is particularly troubling to him with regard to the swifts and the swallows and the martins, that his particular favourites. He wrote 4 papers for the Philosophical Transactions, 74 and 75, on the house martin, sand martin, swallow, and swift. And he watches them with tremendous admiration, really. He really didn't want them to go, that's the thing. And he sent out a whole posse of men to hunt on the sort of scrubby end of the hanger that you can see here, where he thought the martins had seen them in November. He thought they might stay for the winter. And the next spring, he sent, all the villagers went out and had a look, and they looked for a whole week. And they found none. And they had no luck, but he still kept hoping. But I think the way that he watches them, watches everything closely, as we've gathered, is remarkable. And this is our house martin. And I put that slide in. That slide is simply from Wikipedia. It's Wikimedia Commons. And I put it in because I think to us, I know all of you, but to me, growing up, or children and grandchildren, we have all these photographs, we have videos, we have slides. When my 10-year-old granddaughter asked what I was talking about, and I said it's about a naturalist, and she said, "Oh, like David Attenborough." So I said, "Yes." Yeah. And then I realized that those programs, what have they done to them? I mean, they could look at that. You can see a film of a house martin building a nest. You can put a camera inside an anthill, or you can do all these things. But 1760s, 1770s, this was very much not the case. And what Gilbert White does is he did that for that generation in words. Everything had to be in words. And so here is the house martin. And this is how he describes this little tiny scene. About the middle of May, if the weather be fine, the martin begins to think in earnest of providing a mansion for its family. So crust or shell made of dirt or loam to be hand, tempered or wrought together with little bits of broken straws to render it tough and tenacious, wattle and daub, very good. As this bird often builds against a perpendicular wall, it requires its utmost efforts to get the first foundations firmly fixed. On this occasion, the bird not only clings with its claws, but partly supports itself by strongly inclining its tail against the wall, making that a fulcrum, and thus steadied, it works and plasters. You can actually see that here, can't you? But then that this work may not, while it is soft and green, pull itself down by its own weight, the provident architect has prudence and forbearance enough not to advance her work too fast, but by building only in the morning and by dedicating the rest of the day to food and amusement, gives it sufficient time to dry and harden. So it's this lovely idea that you finish, you think, right, I've done enough now, that you know that it needs to harden. How did they know that it needs to harden? So you can go off and play, food and amusement. The language is different. It could, it is anthropomorphic, yes, with his prudent architect and showing forbearance and going off to play. But what he does, I think, is uses language that allows us to identify with the subject. So it's a sort of mode of entry into the existence of a fellow creature. And that's the revolutionary thing, that you use your imagination when you are talking about the natural world. You needn't be ashamed of using your imagination as long as you're accurate about what you see. And that's related to a current discourse whether animals have feelings, or are they using, what kind of intelligence they're using that is different to human reason. So in the late 17th century, many people, including Gilbert White's great mentor, John Ray, had protested against the view of Descartes that animals were machines, automata. So you have Hume writing in the mid-18th century of the passions in his treatise of human nature, argues that it was clear that love and hatred are common to the whole sensitive creation, while the affection of parents to their young proceeds from a peculiar instinct in animals as well as in our species. So we are instinctual too. And among White's contemporaries, Joseph Priestley maintained that animals possess the same faculties as humans in kind, though not in degree. Priestley doesn't write much on animals. When he does, he does think they're useful for experiments on gas, but not much beyond that. But he does say he attributes differences in behavior to variations in brain structure rather than to the absence of reason. And as brutes have the same external senses that we have, they have, of course, all the same inlets to ideas that we have, the theory of perception and association. Also, since they evidently have memory, passions, will, and judgment, they must, of course, have the faculty which we call abstraction, though not having the use of words, they cannot communicate their ideas to us. And you feel that sort of sense of sameness and separateness and interest in communication, that there are communities of animals, communities of birds. And Gilbert White writes about birdsong, the language of birds is very ancient, and like other ancient modes of speech, very elliptical. Little is said, but much is meant and understood. He never doubts that animals have feelings, I think, and he uses this language of human relationships to describe that. But I think when he's thinking about instinct, he's overwhelmed about how brilliant it is, as here, but also how bizarre it can be. So when Barrington suggests that the cuckoo doesn't simply find the nearest convenient nest, but seeks that one that is congenerous in some degree to which to entrust its young, Gilbert is fascinated, and he does his local research again. He asked all his neighbours and discovered that cuckoos were seen around the village only in the nests of wagtails, sparrows, pipits, warblers, and robins, all soft-billed, insectivorous birds. And if it turned out that the cuckoo was capable of seeing which species were the best mothers and left their eggs only with them, this would be adding wonder to wonder and instancing in a fresh manner that the methods of providence are not subjected to any mode or rule, but astonish us in new lights and in various and changeable appearances. So the description sort of sounds like theories of innate reflexes. The idea that the minds of all living creatures have a range of inbuilt structures and capacities. And it's interesting too, in relation to providence, in that in his, he still worked as a curate and he gave his sermons, but he hardly mentions God at all in the natural history, preferring to use the word providence. That energy comes from within the world itself. So I think what readers found, looking back at that house martin or the snake and things like that, in White's letters and diary is curiosity, wonder, and just this sheer, what we forget if we're looking at it academically, the sheer pleasure in seeing, and that you don't always have to be too serious. There's a wonderful bravura passage about how birds move, which just gives some idea of this and some idea of his own pleasure, which comes through the prose. So rooks, he writes, sometimes dive and tumble in a frolicsome manner. Crows and daws swagger in their walk, Woodpeckers fly volatu undosa, opening and closing their wings at every stroke, and are always rising or falling in curves. All of this genus use their tails, which incline downward, as a support while they run up trees. Parrots, like all other hook-clawed birds, walk awkwardly and make use of their bills as a third foot, climbing and ascending with ridiculous caution. The kingfisher darts along like an arrow. Fern owls or goatsuckers glance in the dark over the tops of trees like a meteor. Starlings, as it were, swim along, while missel thrushes use a wild and desultory flight. Swallows sweep over the surface of the ground and water and distinguish themselves by rapid turns and quick evolutions. Skylarks rise and fall perpendicularly as they sing. Woodlarks hang poised in the air. So what we get from that is just his clear enjoyment that observation becomes a real kind of fluid language and way of looking at the world. So to end about with the idea of looking and finding wonder in things that are very close to you, I just end with Gilbert White's famous, I think famous is the right word, tortoise, Timothy. And Timothy has actually belonged to Gilbert White's aunt, Rebecca Snook, for 40 years, and he'd bought from a sailor in Chichester for 2 and 6pence. And when Rebecca died, Gilbert filled a box with earth, took it over to Sussex, and carried him home on the coach, though he says it much resented the insult by hissing. So Timothy arrives, surveys the premises, retreats, and in late April, this was early spring, we get the first of the notes, which go on all through the year. Tortoise comes forth and walks around his coop, will not eat lettuce yet, goes to sleep at 4:00 p.m. Going to be very precise. By 2nd of May, tortoise marches about, eat part of a piece of cucumber paring. So Gilbert really subjects him to proper observation. They know where that he eats, where he walks, they weigh him, they examine his dung and his urine. They see how he dislikes rain and covers himself with dry grass when it gets too hot. And one July, he and a friend, they dunk him in a tub of water to see if the species is amphibious. It proves not to be the case. He sunk and walked on the bottom, and Gilbert White says, seemed quite out of his element and was much dismayed. He was out of his element, poor thing. Another experiment also fails. When we call loudly through the speaking trumpet to Timothy, he does not seem to regard the noise. There's a terrific panic, May 1784, when Timothy escapes. And Gilbert White writes a very whimsical letter about this, saying how he'd been discovered in a neighbouring meadow far, far away, and he'd gone, he thought, on an adventure and escape. And so that he thought that beautiful females might inhabit those vast spaces, which appeared boundless in his eye. But having wandered till he was tired, and having met with nothing but weeds and coarse grass and solitude, he was glad to return to the poppies and lettuces and other luxuries of the garden. And he watches him in autumn, digging his winter hole. He scrapes at the ground. This is very interesting, he feels, with its 4 feet, and throws it up over its back with its hind legs. But the motion of its legs is ridiculously slow, little exceeding the hour hand of a clock, and is suitable to the composure of an animal said to be a whole month in performing 1 feat of copulation. Do not know whether this is the case or not. Does even Timothy have feeling, when he's much dismayed, have intelligence, have reason? How does he know how to do this? 1782, Gilbert watches him getting into the sun under the fruit wall and cleverly tilting his shell against the wall to get the full warmth on his back. Yet this poor reptile, he writes, has never read that plains inclining to the horizontal receive more heat from the sun than any other elevation. So I think that we can take our enjoyment just in the sheer detail and loving record that Gilbert White left us. But we can see him too. He's a revolutionary field naturalist, immersed in the local, convinced of the importance of the most despised apparent creatures like worms. And in his writing, the truly different thing is that poetry and observation, science and sensibility overlap and merge. And in that quiet way, that's why I think he is a revolutionary naturalist. So thank you very much.